Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Michael. Thanks all of you for coming today. I learned if you have a long introduction, you don't have to talk for as long, right? So it seems to me that Passover, with its own history of oppression and freedom, seems like an appropriate moment for me to speak with you about this gallery on level 3 of the American Wing, which is called War and Spirituality, because the gallery itself and Passover are stories about survival and faith. And those points, survival and faith, really underpin this room. It's Gallery 328, if you'd like to go see it after the lecture today. They aren't the only characteristics of the art contained in that room, but somehow I think they're reflective also of the time in which I conceived of this gallery. It was a pandemic project, and somehow faith and survival seemed top of my mind. So today we're going to look at the art and artists in this room and also peek together at how the space came together. So a little bit of a behind the scenes. It all really started with this painting by Knaths. Our Art of the Americas team had challenged each other to think a little bit differently about our collection. We had an opportunity to redo all the galleries on the 3rd floor, the 20th century floor of the wing, and we decided not to just get the same old things out and tell the same old history of style that we have often related in the past, but instead to think about how to re-energize our collections by bringing in different objects or by creating new juxtapositions. This Knaths painting was acquired in 1960, and I'm not sure it had ever been on view since 1960. I'd seen it in storage many, many times, but I could never quite make sense of it. And part of the reason is it's in 2 pieces, and the 2 pieces were stored on 2 separate racks in storage, and you can see how big they are in this photo of it in our new conservation center. And so you could never see the whole thing. You couldn't see the whole thing at the same time. You couldn't, the way it was hung in storage, you couldn't even pull out 2 racks and look at it together. So it was a voyage of discovery. I had only a really vague knowledge about Carl Knaths. We have a few of his still lifes, like the duck decoy that you see here on the right, painted in 1940, about the same time as the painting I just showed you. And we had still lifes and landscapes by Knaths in the collection and other things I'd seen over the years. He's a modern, abstract-ish painter who's in a lot of museum collections. And I knew that he was active in Provincetown. You see a photograph of him from our own collection here on the left. But this painting seemed so different from those landscapes of pine trees on the Cape and tabletop still lifes of objects or of flowers. It was so much more serious, especially with its title, Day of Atonement, which immediately brought to mind that most holy day of the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. And the date of the painting, 1939 to 40. How could that not be about the events surrounding the outbreak of the Second World War? Well, in our object file was a letter from Knaths, and Knaths wrote to the museum when asked about his painting that he was, and I quote, influenced by Picasso's Guernica as far as I was able to comprehend it at that time. Here is Picasso's Guernica from 1937. Spain was already riven by civil war when Picasso made this anguished, monumental canvas. It was divided between the forces of the Republicans on the left and General Francisco Franco on the right. Franco supported by the German National Socialist Party. Picasso, who was then in Paris, had been commissioned to create a mural for the Spanish pavilion at the Paris Exposition of 1937, and he began to do that. But when the Nazi Luftwaffe bombed the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937, a bombing that captured international attention because it intentionally targeted civilians. Does this sound familiar to you? Picasso abandoned all his early mural sketches, and he made this composition instead. It's stylized violence. Women scream, women raise their arms in abject terror, horses scream, corpses lie on the ground. Well, after the Paris Exposition, Franco triumphed in Spain by 1939, and Picasso sent Guernica to the United States, intending it as a means to raise funds for Spanish refugees. And the war broke out in Europe that October. You may remember seeing Guernica at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where it was housed until 1981, when with great ceremony it was returned to Spain and is now displayed at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. But you might not know that the painting also toured the United States in the early 1940s in a Picasso retrospective organized by MoMA in 1939, which came to the ICA in Boston in 1940. The ICA was founded as sort of a sister satellite museum of the Museum of Modern Art, and they took many of MoMA's exhibitions. I'm showing you here my favorite picture of trucks unloading at the old building for the Institute of Contemporary Art. I love that it says security on the side. And on the lower left, the exhibition catalog from that 1940 show. So when Knaths paints Day of Atonement, and when he writes that he was influenced by Picasso's Guernica, he was likely speaking about Guernica not from having seen it reproduced in periodicals and books. He was probably speaking about having seen it, not in reproduction, but in person. And for those of you who have seen it, it is a massive, giant painting. Knaths described his own composition as a mural study, immediately linking it with the format of the Picasso. He said it was a mural study depicting heaven and hell, but we don't really know what it was for. Knaths had made murals as one of the artists hired by the Works Progress Administration during the 1930s, when so many artists were employed in making public murals. But the ones I know about that Knaths painted didn't look anything like this. And the subject matter is a little bit hard to figure out. And the preliminary drawing that we have in our collection doesn't help a whole lot. When I read the painting, though, I see the flames of war and violence, obviously hell, rising up and invading a more peaceful scene at the top of the composition. There's a vicious hellhound and an armed figure rising up from the dark part of the composition, threatening the maternal figure at upper left, whose companion is literally and physically disarmed. Knaths' title, too, links it to current events, and I would remind you that in September 1939, in a brutal bombing campaign, the Nazis set the Jewish quarter of Warsaw on fire. Their action came during the High Holy Days, which culminate in Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This political reading of Knaths' work, I don't think is completely my invention. Here's another painting by Knaths from 1941 in the collection of the Albright Knox. It's called Doomsday. So once it was decided that the Knaths would be one of the main features of this gallery, I needed to think about what would go with it. And I began to think about the schism, really, that developed during this period between abstraction and figuration, between dematerializing the subject on the one hand and emphasizing its physicality on the other, of the differences between spirit and matter. And it seemed like just the place for this juxtaposition. Hyman Bloom's female corpse back view from 1947 on the left, and Jackson Pollock's Troubled Queen from 1945 on the right. So the installation includes the painting that was always going to be out in any gallery of American art during the 1940s, Jackson Pollock, but it was asking the Pollock to do a little bit different work than just raising the flag for the development of abstract expressionism in the United States. Pollock was at a transitional point in his career when he painted Troubled Queen, abandoning his earlier figurative work and developing the slashing, dripped abstractions for which he is best known. Here, if you can make them out on the right, two very agitated, mask-like faces seem like they're peering through skeins of paint, also sort of reacting, responding, trapped by jagged lines and acid colors, a tense composition whose turbulence reflects not only Pollock's deliberate manifestation of his own personal psychological state at this point, but also the fragmentation and violence of a world that was riven by war. While Bloom, on the left, does something else. As you can see, it is clearly, and in a most difficult way, tied to the physical world. Critic Clement Greenberg, one of the leading New York critics of the day, linked Bloom's disturbing imagery of corpses to the Holocaust, a connection that Bloom himself disavowed, maintaining that the true subject of his corpse paintings was the metamorphosis of matter into spirit. For Bloom, the material and the mystical were integral to each other. New life was to be found within death, and the process of decomposition was a process of new life forms coming out. Life is not just what you experience on Earth, Bloom said. You don't just die and rot away. That would tell us that life is trivial, and that wouldn't make sense. For me, by linking these two works together, we also really confront the nature of dematerialization in different ways. The physical collapse of the body on the one hand, and on the other, the disappearance of subject matter from painting. And we might ask why Pollock is in all of the art history books, and Bloom and his colleagues are not. The adjacent wall of the gallery also deals with the spiritual and the physical. It's centered on this piece, Walker Hancock's scale model for the Pennsylvania Railroad War Memorial, which he did from 1949 to 1952. Those of you who take Amtrak through Philadelphia will see it at the Philadelphia 30th Street Station. And our plaster version of it is a smaller maquette in preparation for a much larger piece. Hancock might be somewhat familiar to you. He lived and worked in Gloucester and is best known for realistic works like this one. Hancock served in World War II. In fact, he was one of the monuments men who sought to protect art and architecture from destruction and theft. So the actual bronze memorial in Philadelphia is 40 feet tall. And it's a memorial to the more than 1,300 employees of the Pennsylvania Railroad who lost their lives in World War II. Hancock used a very traditional figurative style to depict really an abstract belief that the death of the body would be succeeded by the eternity of the spirit. His lifeless soldier, half nude, is freed from the earth, lifted heavenward by the Archangel Michael. And it's interesting to me that this spiritual subject of the translation of the soul is represented by one of the most physically demanding, solid, heavy, difficult pieces in the gallery. And I just want to show you what I mean. It looks so beautiful in these professional photographs. The thing is actually in 5 pieces. And I just want to show you what it took to get it into that gallery. On the left, just the base being moved into position by our riggers, Dante Valance and Neil McGregor. And on moving it, the second portion, which is basically from the soldier's feet to his knees, on top. In the third picture, putting the angel and the figure on top of that. And then in the scariest part of the operation, taking these giant plaster, like if they fall on the floor, they break, wings, putting them in the lift and fitting them into the slots in the back of the sculpture. And I think you can see our crew, Danny, and Nat, celebrating that they managed to get this thing together without it falling apart. We all celebrated. Of course, then the next question is, what on earth do you put with it? So we decided, or I decided, let's be blunt, on these 2 paintings. Hyman Bloom's Chandelier No. 2 from 1945 on the left, and Norman Lewis's Every Atom Glows, Electrons in Luminous Vibration from 1951. So the Bloom on the left is one of many paintings he made that are of chandeliers in synagogues. There were 14 synagogues in Boston's West End, which is where Bloom grew up. And he tends to abstract them and enlarge them. You don't really see, unless you're familiar with synagogue architecture, that this is a big glass chandelier hanging from a roof that has painted decorations on the ceiling. He takes it out of the architecture completely, abstracting and showing it dripping with intense light that he implies with really thick gobs of pigment. The paint is so substantive, but the subject matter is completely ephemeral. Bloom somehow manages to dissolve the substance that he's working with, transforming the physical into something spiritual. Or as the painter Elaine de Kooning wrote about Bloom, that he packs in his colors until the pigment itself seems to assume an extraordinary incandescence. The deep yellows expand and shrink in a flood of multicolored light, which sets every dab of paint in motion before your eyes. On the right, Norman Lewis, who you may remember from last week's session as the artist of the Harlem Jazz Jamboree, a scene of Harlem musicians playing horn and piano that featured so beautifully in Noni and George's presentation about music last week. He started as a figurative painter, but then in the mid-1940s, he turns towards abstraction. Where does this title, Every Atom Glows, come from? Well, it actually comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote in 1844 in his famous essay, Nature, and I quote, Self-kindled, every atom glows, and hence the future which it holds. So Lewis names this black and white composition, every atom glows, electrons in luminous vibration. Well, that future that Emerson spoke of had arrived, maybe not in exactly the same way he envisioned, but it had certainly arrived when Lewis painted this blurred and flickering abstraction, which I think speaks both to the horrific destruction of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, as well as to the life-giving force encapsulated in a tiny, tiny element of nature. We think of the destruction of the bomb, and I'm showing you here an atomic bomb explosion. Some of us are old enough to remember what these look like and how terrifying they are. I do remember crawling under my desk because that was going to save us. But we also have to remember that the atomic age was also an age of great optimism about the future of science and all the things that science could help with. I show you the Atoms for Peace stamp, inventiveness of man, as you can see at the upper right, and about the future of atomic power for powering a modern lifestyle, even to the point where you could buy for your son, in this case, but presumably also your daughter, an atomic energy lab toy, so you could make atomic energy in your basement. Hopefully not. But there was such a belief in the positive potential of atomic power. And I think they are linked inextricably in Lewis's image. Well, atomic power seems also linked to me to the images around the corner from the Lewis, as you can see here. What we see are three paintings. Mark Tobey's Burned Over from 1947, Orozco's El Fuego, or Man of Fire, from 1938, and at the center, Jackson Pollock's Bowl, representing the flight of man, from about 1939. So Tobey, who was a West Coast artist, converted to the Baha'i faith when he was in his late 20s, and he embraced a philosophy of unity between all things. He found the spiritual world to be more real than the physical world. He was an inveterate traveler, traveling all over China, Japan, India, and he did not privilege the traditions and innovations of European painting over what he had learned from the arts of Asia. His all-over abstractions, like Burned Over, are compositions without borders, without direction. They're meditative, layered, delicate lines that settle over boulder shapes like a spider's web. Orozco, at the upper right, is best known as a muralist, and some of you may have seen his amazing murals at Dartmouth in the library. He's considered one of Mexico's tres grandes, the three big ones, along with Diego Rivera and David Alfaro Siqueiros. Orozco's vision was very much shaped by the Mexican Revolution, and his imagery is marked by its violence. Fire and figures surrounded by flames recur in his work. And his mural that represents Prometheus, the Greek titan who stole fire from heaven and gave it to humans, was unveiled at Pomona College in Claremont, California in 1930. 9 years later, he completed his masterpiece, Man of Fire, which fills the dome of a hospital in Guadalajara, and this small canvas in our own collection relates to that central figure. Orozco inspired Pollock, who at the time he made this bowl in about 1939 was suffering from alcoholism and depression and undergoing Jungian psychoanalysis. He made about 10 of these bowls as sort of art therapy. They were intended to help artists, to help people work through their issues of self-esteem and conflict. But the intertwined figures and fiery colors that swirl around this bowl are very much related to Orozco's work, which Pollock admired. Now, you may have noticed that this gallery is named the Sandra B. and William Lane Gallery. And you might be thinking, well, where the heck are the paintings that belong to the Lane collection? And those paintings, some of which I show you on the right, are the ones we think of when we think of the Lane collection. Dove's that red one, O'Keeffe's Calla Lily on gray, Sheeler's Ore into Iron. But you might not really recognize that the Lane collection is bigger than that. And the Toby, the Bloom, and the Carl Zerby that you now see on the screen, and I'll talk about the Zerby in a minute, are also all from the Lane collection. It's not the peaceful landscape, pretty colors that we associate so much with artists like Dove and O'Keeffe, but it also has a very turbulent underside, much less studied than the other works. And there was another story that I wanted to tell in this gallery, a story that centered on a group of artists in Boston who have been very much overlooked in favor of the New York abstract expressionist art scene. These artists, who you see here on the wall in the gallery view here, were all immigrants, all Jewish, and too often ignored. They formed an important artistic circle here that have been called the Boston Expressionists. They never adopted abstraction, but in their figurative paintings, which were characterized by bold brushstrokes and color, surge with some of the same energy and emotion. So I'm asking you to broaden boundaries, not only from New York to New England, but also internationally, thanks to some key pictures from the art of Europe, like the one you see on the right, and also to broaden our definition of mid-20th century American art by thinking about everything is not abstract expressionism. So here you see on the left Carl Zerby's Job from 1949 and a double portrait by Max Beckmann. Beckmann was an influential, important artist in Germany before Hitler came to power in the 1930s. And when that happened, Beckmann was declared a cultural Bolshevik. And in 1937, hundreds of Beckmann's work were confiscated and included in the infamous Degenerate Art exhibition in Munich that year. Beckmann and his wife immediately fled to the Netherlands, enduring about a decade of very, very difficult years before finally, after repeat efforts, got visas to emigrate to the United States, and they came in 1947. I think you see reality and illusion merging in the portrait that you see on the right of his friends Hans Warszensky and Kurt Valentin. This meeting was entirely fictional because these two men never gathered together in Amsterdam, where Beckmann was living in 1947. Warszensky was a Jewish German scholar of medieval art who came to the US in 1938. He championed Beckmann's work, and he also served as curator here at the MFA from 1948 to 1972. Valentin was a Jewish-German dealer in modern art who represented Beckmann. He's shown here holding a candle, a symbol of hope and a testament to a friendship that survived the dangerous years of the Nazi regime. Valentin immigrated to the US in 1937. He opened a gallery in New York where he sold modern art, including many of the works that the National Socialists had seized for museums and private collectors as degenerate, avant-garde, modern, abstract work like Beckmann's. Zerby, whose work you see on the left, was German. He began his career in Germany under Beckmann's influence. He emigrated to the US in 1934 and led the paintings department at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts here from 1937 to 1955. And here he tells the Old Testament story of Job, a tale of resilience in the face of calamity, which must have seemed especially resonant in the years surrounding World War II. It recounts the tale of a prosperous man whose faith is tested and proven by God. He loses his wealth, his family, and his health, but never his belief. And Job's trials might also have had additional meaning for Zerby. In fact, at just this moment, his preferred art-making technique, which is to work in encaustic, a wax-based medium, he developed respiratory problems from his own technique and had to give it up. So I think the trials that we see in this gallery are also represented by some of the works on paper that have been on view in this gallery. I'm just showing you two of the series of rotations that we've had. W. Eugene Smith's American Infantryman on the left from 1945, and Francisco Dosamonte's Dead Soldier, Fascism from 1940 on the right. Again, crossing borders, mixing media, breaking boundaries. Dosamontes was a printmaker and muralist in Mexico. He promoted social causes through art. His Dead Soldier on the right was the last entry in a series of prints he made depicting the cruelty of authoritarianism that was happening throughout Europe in the 1930s. This soldier, whose helmet is cracked, his body wrapped and contorted, reflects lives lost indiscriminately from fascist German bombings, again, like Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. Smith, who many of you may know as a photojournalist, supplied many of his images to Life magazine, and during World War II, he was embedded with American forces in the Pacific, documenting their experiences in camp and in battle. And one of his photo series was of a day in the life of a soldier, in this case, Terry Moore, who was a gunner serving in the 7th Infantry. And on the verso of this print, a pencil inscription reads, "Battle for Okinawa, Moore hits the dust as the shell screams." Both Smith and Moore were wounded by mortar fire soon afterwards, and miraculously, both of them survived. And I want to close my portion of our time together on that positive note, showing you these two works also in the gallery, both of them about faith and hope in a period of violence, migration, and upheaval. On the left, Jacques Lipschitz's Miracle from 1947, and on the right, Jacob Lawrence's Life, Death, and Resurrection from 1955. So there is also courage and hope and unimagined possibilities in these works. And the artists speak to us still, I think, offering us meditations on those topics: fear, doubt, belief, and in a variety of ways, I think, even as they rip apart illusion, either physically or philosophically, they still burst with life and with humanity. Thank you. I'll turn this over to my wonderful colleague, Michael.
So good afternoon. Hope everyone is doing well. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Bramwell, and I'm the Joyce Linde Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art here at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And it's with great pleasure today that I have the opportunity of helping us to understand and broaden our perspective of what folk and self-taught art really is. And one of the ways that we can do that today is by understanding that the spiritual impulse is something that is not only reflected in, but is actually proselytized through folk and self-taught art. So,
for my Lord, let us make a record for my Lord. Come on, let's make a record for my Lord. Let's make a record for my Lord. Prophet Ezekiel made a record for my Lord. Ezekiel made a record for my Lord. Cause let's make a record for my Lord. Let's make a record for my Lord. I want to make a record for my Lord. Hallelujah. Come on, let's make a record. I want to make a record for my Lord. I want to make a record for my Lord. I want to make a record for my Lord. Don't you want to make a record for my Lord? Don't you want to make a record for my Lord? Holy, holy, holy. My God, come on, let's make a record. Give up the world. Give up Lucifer.
Obviously, one of my favorite folk and self-taught artists of all time, Sister Gertrude Morgan. I think one of the ways that we can expand our understanding of folk and self-taught art is to first and foremost orient ourselves to the kind of vocabulary that they use and what's going to be important for us to understand this work. One of the things that Paul the Apostle said when he was writing to the church in Corinth, he said and I'll quote, "But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him, neither can he know them because they are spiritually discerned." And what that means is that we don't have to be believers to understand this art, but we have to understand what motivates these artists to produce this work. And I thought a way forward this morning for us, this afternoon rather, is to look at a few keywords that will help us understand. So I don't know if you have your handouts, but as we go through this PowerPoint slide, one of the things that I want you to reference is think about these keywords in relation to what we're going to be talking about with these artists. So there are, first and foremost, aesthetics. And this is the branch of philosophy concerned with principles of beauty and artistic taste. Apocalypse. It means the complete and final destruction of the world in biblical terms. Creative believers. Those are people who combine both art and spirituality in order to proselytize the gospel. And this will become very important throughout this particular lecture when we see that not only do these artists reflect spirituality in their work, but they also try to push the social and gospel agenda forward. Faith, simply a strong belief. Prophecy, a religious prediction. Proselytize, which is what I just said, and it means to spread the gospel. Repentance is a stage of salvation in which one turns from evil and begins to turn toward righteousness. And the last one is salvation, which is deliverance from sin and evil. And all of these words, I'd like you to keep them in mind as we go through these various artists. So this lecture examines the spiritual and religious impulse that animates and drives folk and self-taught art. These works are, as I like to think about them, a living religious cultural tradition. And remember, there are two important words, religious and cultural. They're combined together in this type of art. It's a specific kind of faith that's contained within these works. And oftentimes, these artists have received visions and they hear voices commanding them to produce this work. So in a way, the work is a result of their, what we call a positive externality with divine encounter. They encounter the divine, who then motivates them toward producing this work. This lecture also contributes at the juncture of art and religion. It looks at the history of faith systems which are going to be important for these types of artists. Most of them come from the southern United States, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Florida. But the key is we see other forms of folk and self-taught art with religious dimensions in the Southwest as well, where there is the Spanish, Mexican, Catholic tradition, as well as Native American art. As I said earlier, the South is the epicenter from which this art comes from. What I want to focus on is this notion of creative belief, what I like to call creative belief. And these are people who tap into the first cosmic principle, which is God's creativity. They have not been academically trained for the most part and fall outside the art historical canon, but nevertheless produce powerful works of art. Many of these works of art deal with America's painful past, the inhumane practices of enslavement and the segregationist policies of Jim Crow and the institutionalized racism that is alive and well in the 21st century. The artists we will discuss this afternoon have been called folk, outsider, visionary, self-taught, unschooled, art brute, and vernacular. But whatever name you may choose to call them, the Bible creates a foundation for their highly individualized cultural practices. There are two very important developments in the history of art and cultural studies that have contributed to the validity of this form of art. First of all, there is the non-academic artistic traditions have been invited into the art historical canon. And this change allowed art that has not been formally developed to have its expression within cultural space. And the other development has to do with the methodologies from material cultural studies that have allowed an examination of how objects and images function within American religious life. It is called material religion, and it works at the intersection of the spiritual, cultural, and the religious. In this lecture, we will also produce case studies that will illustrate some of the key words that we talked about earlier. This is like I said earlier, one of my favorite artists, Sister Gertrude Morgan. She was born in 1900 in Lafayette, Alabama, and she died in 1980 in New Orleans. Sister Gertrude Morgan was a preacher, artist, and musician who lived and worked in New Orleans, a city she referred to as the headquarters of sin, actually where my dad was from. Morgan moved to New Orleans in 1939 and quickly established an orphanage with two missionaries called Mother Margaret Parker and Sister Cora Williams, who were both members of the Holiness and Sanctified movement, an African-American denomination known for its syncopated gospel music and expressive forms of worship. In the mid-1950s, Morgan began painting scenes that were guided by God and served as visual aids accompanying her preaching and singing. And I want to pause for a second because this is an important dimension to consider. Much of this work that you will see this afternoon are simply aids to further the proselytization, keyword, of the gospel. We look at them as works of art because we're considering them within the context of a museum or within the context of art history. But many of these artists did not consider themselves artist at all. Art was just a means to an end. Morgan painted on doors, styrofoam food trays, detergent boxes, and paper, window shades and toilet paper rolls, using the simplest, the simplest of materials. She used tempera or acrylic paint, pencils and pens, and crayons. Morgan's brightly colored paintings generally depict scenes from the Bible and are accompanied by the artist's own hand and written explanations. In 1957, Morgan proclaimed herself the bride of Christ. And you may be wondering why she would always wear her what looks like a nurse's outfit. Does anybody know? Well, she considered Jesus Dr. Jesus. And if Dr. Jesus was Dr. Jesus, that was his nurse. And that's what she said. So, the same year, Morgan moved out of the orphanage and into her house in New Orleans, Lower Ninth Ward. Also painted white, she established the Everlasting Gospel Mission from her home. Morgan hosted music-driven worship services and prayer meetings for 2 decades. She also used the small house as a studio space. In 1974, Morgan announced that the Lord had commanded her to stop painting and making works of art and begin to focus exclusively on preaching, and she obeyed, creating only a handful of works from that time until her death in 1980. Sister Gertrude Morgan, along with Bill Traylor and Thornton Doyle, are one of the highest grossing artists at auction now, along with William Edmondson. And I think that has something to do with the transcendental nature of their work. The spiritual impulse is something that has lasted throughout history and has been extremely important, not only in antiquity, where we saw the ancient Hebrews that were under African captivity in Egypt, and they developed that Exodus narrative where God delivered them, and as the story goes, sort of opened the Red Sea, and they were able to come out from that captivity. Well, that Exodus narrative is a spiritual narrative, right? It's divine intervention that helps with material conditions in this world. It's also part of what we see in other areas in terms of the United States. The founding myth of the United States, as we remember, had to do with the Puritans who sort of left Europe and came to the United States. Well, that was sort of an exodus, if you will, into the new land or the new Jerusalem, right, for the chosen people. So that became sort of a founding myth, that exodus myth of how divine intervention helps with material things in the world. And then we see it again during the antebellum period in the 19th century. We currently have an exhibition now called Hear Me Now, the Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina. And in that exhibition, it features the work of David Drake. And David Drake, as you will find if you visit the exhibition, was an enslaved potter. But not only was he making pots, if you look at the writing that he did on his pots, much of it had spiritual import. He talked about things like repent or you will be lost. So he was talking to his enslavers, telling them to repent from the horror and tragedy of of slavery and look toward a better way of being in the world. And we remember why she's dressed in white. This next artist is one of my favorite also, because it's mysterious. And of course, we know that the spirit is in fact mysterious. Something we can't hold on to, something we can't understand. It just moves in the world. This is James Hampton, the throne of the third heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly, considered one of the greatest works of religious sculpture. James Hampton, 1909, was a black man from Ellery, South Carolina. He worked the night shift as a janitor for the General Services Administration in Washington, a government agency. After he finished his janitorial work at midnight, he would come back to a rented alleyway stable, fashioning from materials that were scavenged on the job, brought in secondhand stores, and found on the streets. And he created a three-tiered, symmetrical revelation of St. John the Divine. He intended, when he was done, to open a storefront ministry, but it never happened. For 14 years, and I should say before I go on, this is the only piece of art that he created in his life. For 14 years, Hampton had been building the throne of the third heaven using various shimmering metallic foils. Paper, cardboard, nails, furniture, light bulbs covered with aluminum shards. And he said, one would ask, why did you cover the light bulbs with aluminum foil? And he said it related to the fact that Christ was the light of the world. The artistic ingenuity transforming common objects into uncommon form is not new. Sometimes it is whimsical, like Picasso's bicycle seat that he transformed into a bull's head. And at other times, in the case of Hampton, it was governed by what he could afford and what God told him to do. The centerpiece of Christ's throne is flanked by a section on the right that refers to the New Testament and on the left that refers to the Old Testament. The large pieces are mounted on platforms and old furniture such as armchairs and tables that he scavenged around his neighborhood that he used for gold and aluminum. Cigarette boxes, wine bottles, kitchen rolls. Does this sound familiar? Other artists use these kinds of materials too, transforming common material into uncommon things. And he would often pull these things with a child's wagon, that he would haul these treasures he had found from garbage dumps and the government building in which he worked. Hampton's throne is now located in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. If you go there, it's on permanent display, and I would encourage you, if you're ever in the area, you will stay at least a half an hour meditating on the level of detail and the level of commitment that it took to produce this work. This is a 14-year work. And I should say again that nobody knew what he was doing. He did all of this in secret. And it wasn't until he died and the landlord showed up to collect the rent that they found this structure that he'd been working on in total isolation. Nobody knew about it, and it wasn't important that anyone knew about it. He was preparing this throne, as he thought, for the coming of Christ. He felt that once Christ came back to earth, he needed a throne room in which to occupy. And so this is what he was creating. It's really a profound work of art. Hampton's throne was painstakingly constructed out of countless bits of metallic, foil paper, plastic, strips of metal cut from coffee cans, jelly jars, flower vases, wood furniture, cardboard, tape, tacks, and pins. The foil-wrapped bulbs that we talked about earlier are a poetic reference to Jesus, as I said earlier, being the light of the world. Working alone at night after he finished his job, he unleashed spiritual feelings that were expressed in inner visions of his world. And one of the most fantastic things that I have found so far that he did is produced 14 notebooks full of what he called divine writings. He said the Spirit would speak to him, and it was important that he would record everything that the Spirit told him. He called himself St. James, and he ended each page of these 14 thick volumes with revelation. And no one has been able to crack the code. They gave the Smithsonian gave the books to many code experts from the military trying to crack it, and we still don't know exactly what it means. But we have a pretty good idea what he was writing about. Next artist, Howard Finster. He was born in 1916 or 15, accounts vary. He was a self-taught environmental and visionary artist. Howard Finster has become one of the most prominent names in American folk art. His story sounds like it was ripped right from the pages of traditional folk tales. He was a man of vision, having his first vision at age 3. Look at his eyes. When he saw his recently deceased sister walking down out of the sky wearing a white gown. He was born again in the Baptist revival at age 13 and became a preacher at 16, somewhat like James Baldwin. Later in his life, he had another vision. This time, God came to him in the form of a face on an index finger, telling him to paint only sacred art. This vision helped him spread the gospel by producing thousands of paintings, and each painting was numbered. And he has over 10,000 paintings, and we have one in the MFA's collection. And actually, if you have time, go up to the 3rd floor galleries, and you can see it. It's the trumpet of Gabriel, and on this trumpet, what he's saying is that everyone get ready, because the end of time, or the apocalypse, keyword, is coming soon, and you need to repent and get right. So if you have an opportunity, please go up and take a look at it. This is his environment. A third change came in his life when he produced a 15-foot man, and when he saw, rather, a 15-foot man commanding him to decorate his garden for the Lord. For there, Finster began transforming his backyard into the art space that would come to be known as Paradise Garden. If you are in Georgia, that is a site that you definitely need to visit and take a look at. It's fabulous. This was the cathedral that he constructed, and he did this over a period of 15 years. And he did it with very minimal help. People used to bring scraps for him, and how he constructed this without any architectural background, we still haven't figured out. But he was, if you asked him, he'd probably say it was divinely influenced. But it's really fascinating to see what he produced. This is his house, and as you will see, most of his art, and he said he produced his art as a way of spreading the gospel. Again, proselytize, key word. Each of these artists not only reflect the religious dimension, but they use their art to further the religious dimension. He didn't consider himself an artist until later in his life, when the art began to be appreciated for what it was in and of itself as images and objects. But prior to that, it was just a means to an end. So again, Finster was born in Valley Head, Alabama, to Samuel and Lula Finster, who lived with the family and 13 children. Divine creativity. He grew up in a family of 13 children, as I said, and he was nurtured in the Baptist background, in the long-standing tradition of the Southern evangelical tradition of storytelling, humor, music, making, and in the approach to art and objects that was shaped by this make-do craftsmanship. The Reverend Howard Finster emerged from the rural Appalachia culture of Northeast Alabama and Northwest Georgia to become one of the most important creative personalities in the last quarter of the 20th century. He was a visionary artist and worked in various media, as well as a poet and musician, and his creative output and cultural influence have been enormous. Finster was not unique as a self-taught environmental artist, and many significant individuals in the South and beyond have created distinctive and inspired artworks based on his work. Yet, well before his death, he had produced a highly personal body of work that is readily recognizable in paintings, sculptures, drawings, and prints. And believe it or not, record albums as well. A famous group, I don't know if most of you know, REM, contemporary recording group, but they asked him to make album covers for him. And when asked, why would you be involved with secular music, if you will, he said, by doing those album covers, that was a way of reaching a wider audience with the gospel. Howard Finster has been included in hundreds of exhibitions, including the Venice Biennale in 1984 and a major exhibition at the High Museum in Atlanta, Georgia in 1996. He has also interacted and collaborated with artists, rock musicians, as I said, students and teachers. His biography included 2 major monographs, autobiographical books, and recordings, as well as hundreds of articles and exhibition catalogs. Who else was a musician that we've covered so far? Sister Gertrude Morgan, thank you. This is one of my favorite artists also, Mary T. Smith. Smith was born Mary Tillman in 1905 in Copiah County, southern Mississippi, and grew up in the town of Martinsville. She was the third of 13 children. Divine creativity again. Her sister Elizabeth, the seventh child, described those times. She said, and I quote, "We helped our father on the farm. We struggled on the land. We were raising cabbages, tomatoes, beans, stuff like that. We wrapped vegetables, packed them in boxes, shipped them. The family was working sharecropping, but our father brought his own place after a while," unquote. From an early age, Mary had a serious hearing impairment that made it difficult for her to understand her speech. School was consequently a strain for her. She was able to get to the 5th grade, but that's about it. A significant accomplishment given the times. This was the pre-civil rights South. A significant accomplishment it was a significant accomplishment for non-handicapped African Americans in the area. Her siblings recognized that their strange speaking sister possessed a certain kind of intelligence, but schoolmates and strangers assumed she was off, and she was and often excluded from the activities, and she found her outlets in drawing and painting. And one of her most famous quotes that's reflected in this painting that we may acquire, Dr. Hirshler, we're not sure yet, but if you notice, the figure has upraised hands. And when asked why the hands were raised, she said they act as antennas to put you in touch with God. And so her paintings with raised hands sell for the most money because that was one of her quotes that they could attach to the paintings. But her other paintings sell well as well. Smith left home in her teens and entered, I'm getting ahead of myself, I already had it here. Smith left home in her teens and entered into a brief marriage with a man named Gus Williams. The marriage lasted 2 months. After she caught him deceiving her, she said, quote, "Anybody that tells that big lie, I can't stay with," she told the family. She then went to work for a white family in Wesson, a few miles from Martinsville, and she lived in the house. She washed, cooked, and cleaned for them. And after a few years, she met and married John Smith, a sharecropper, and moved into the cottage on their 2 acres of potato and peanut farm. The marriage was like the first one. It ended abruptly. And this part of the story is kind of tragic and heartbreaking, but this happened in more cases than simply with Mary. When the husband was a sharecropper, and so when her husband's year's settlement was due, they got paid annually. When it was given to her husband, Mary realized that the amount was drastically insufficient. She had meticulously recorded all the data concerning her husband's labor and what he was due. She told the boss, "We only got $17. You must have made a mistake. You owe us $1,154. That's what's supposed to come to us," unquote. The boss ordered John Smith, her husband, to get rid of Mary, send her away, send her packing. Mary Smith's belongings were packed up and sent away. The boss brought him a new wife, and Mary Smith, in her 30s, moves to Hazelnut, Mississippi, where she began to produce some of her most famous works. If you notice the raised hands Again, most valuable pieces. I have another artist. This is the last artist I'd like to introduce. Most of you may know William Edmondson. He was the son of parents who were enslaved in Tennessee, and he didn't consider himself an artist at all, as we've seen most of these artists do not. When he began carving around 1932, after retiring from his job as a laborer, he was inspired by a vision. Who else had a vision? There we go. The vision and the voices and vision you'll see are integral to this form of art making. Williamson was inspired by a vision and that emphasized his divine calling, claiming, "Jesus has planted the seed of carving in me." He described his work as miracles. Edmondson began by carving gravestones, freestanding figurative sculptures and garden ornaments using discarded curb blocks of limestone and using chisels that were fashioned from railroad spikes. He chiseled animals, biblical subjects, and secular figures that were dominating his repertoire. William Edmondson, an artist whose work is valued in the millions of dollars now, is also included in major museums, including our museum. We have a small sculpture, and in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. One of the best quotes that I've heard attributed to Edmondson is he said that all the stones there, cut there in the yard, come from God. It's his mind speaking in my mind. And whether we are believers or not, it's important to understand what fuels and motivates this art. And again, Edmondson never considered himself an artist. He simply was furthering his spiritual beliefs in material form. And he was the first African-American artist to have an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1937. So someone came by and recognized that what he was doing was direct carving, if you will, in stone, and felt that this body of work was worthy of a museum exhibition. There's some other work. The last artist, an artist that's near and dear to my heart. I'm actually working on my dissertation about him, and lo and behold, we have an exhibition now here at the museum about the potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina. But what's really important to me is what he wrote. The pots are important, but what he wrote that concerns spirituality is he says, if you don't listen to the Bible, you will be lost. This was written by an enslaved person on the side of a pot. And even though he never escaped his enslavement in his life, he understood that the pot moved, right? It left his pottery studio, right, and went out to other plantations so that other people handling this pot would begin to read this message. Again, key word, proselytize the gospel through material form. And the last thing I'd like to say, he said, I made this jar all of cross. If you don't repent, you will be lost. This is writing in the antebellum South in 1862. He's writing this. But the messages that David Drake and all of these other artists are putting forward help us understand that we need to all consider our lives in a spiritual dimension, because at the end of the day, it is appointed unto man once to die, but after this, the judgment. Thank you.